Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 7, Halacha 1. This is part 3 of the Shir. And today we're going to be covering this story with Rebbe about how Rebbe is going to allow foreign import of produce into the land. This is a big deal. This is a milestone moment because it really adjusts some of the D'Rabbanan stuff. We're also going to get into some more detail about some of the plants that are mentioned in the Mishnah. Now, before we were talking about a key topic. What about if you have animal food and you want to turn that into medicinal plaster for human? The answer is you're allowed to do that. We have another case. What about if you're trying to make dyes from human food? Well, you're not allowed to do that because it's with the squeezing, you're taking the juice out of them, and you're left with something, if it was human food, that would have been edible. And then you've effectively wasted this edible part, and you just have some juice. And this wasted part that you destroyed basically has Sheviis sanctity, and you've now wasted it, so it's no good. We also have another case. Normally, animal food, it's not going to have. It's going to be a thing where it's going to be lower on the totem pole, so to speak, than human food. Right? It's lower on this chain, but the idea is that. Sorry to use the word totem pole, but I'm trying to get something that's very visual that you can imagine, where you have a chain of hierarchy. And the idea is that you also have a case where you can't take human food and turn it into something that would be a plaster for an animal, because that would also be wasting. And you also have a case where you can have product that cannot be used by humans or animals in the Sheviis year, and that's not going to have sanctity. So, for instance, we covered a root that an animal can't eat, can't use as food, but it can be turned into dyes. So, if it can be turned into dyes that an animal can use, then that's going to have Sheviis sanctity. In the case of animals using dyes, you would use a lower quality dye to make a dye so you can mark the animals so you can know which to bring to slaughter and not. Okay, so the Mishnah is going to talk about Sheviis sanctity and being subject to Beur, and we're going to talk about human foods and the leaf of the wild loof. So if you imagine a leek will have two parts to the plant. That's a recurring theme. That plants will have many parts to it. So the leaf will have one condition in the halacha, and the bulb will have a totally different set of conditions in the halacha. So in the Mishnah, we learned in Uktzin 3:4, it says as follows: it says, the shoots of the service tree, this and the adal and the leaves of the wild loof do not contract food tuma until they are marinated and sweetened. So the idea here is that normally food that is fit for humans contract tuma when they come in contact with a source of tuma, and they can transmit tuma to other foods and beverages that they touch. This, by the way, is called tumat ochlin. So this is food tuma. Now, this idea of the shoot of the service tree, the adal, and the leaves of the wild loof will get marinated in vinegar and salt water, and it will then change, and it will be fit for consumption. So until you've prepared it, basically they're saying that it's not going to be classified as a food, and so it'll be unfit to get food tuma until they are put into a condition where you can use it as food. Okay, that's a very important idea, because now we're going to be getting into these other plants that could be growing, and we're only concerned about something that could be used as food. So if it can't get food tuma, and then it's not going to be considered food. So that's why we're concerned about it. So the Gemara is going to continue, and the Gemara is going to explain, but why do they not contract food tuma before they're sweetened? And the idea is because they are sweetened, they are bitter and inedible, and because they are bitter and edible, they're not classified as a food in the halacha. You just don't normally use it as a food. You have to process it. Now the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, but lupines are bitter and they're inedible before they're cooked. So the law here is that lupine beans are classified as food, and they're going to contract food tuma. And will they contract food tuma even when they're raw? So we see that in the Tosefta and Uskin 3.5 and in the Mishnah there, it's just saying the Tosefta is saying that lupines was shoots of the service tree. So the question is it going to be like what the Tosefta is saying, where it's adding in this extra plant or not? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say lupines are different, for they are in essence human food, and as much as they are cultivated for consumption by humans. And so they're classified as food even before they're cooked. Now, to contrast this, the shoots of the service tree, the adal, and the leaves of the wild loof, these are wild. These are not cultivated for the consumption of humans. You go out to the Jerusalem forest and you can find these things. And so because they're not being cultivated specifically for people, they're not going to be classified as food, and they will not get food tuma until you turn it into something that is fit for human consumption. Now, the intention when you're growing the lupine beans is that you're only growing this for human consumption. And there's a difference, okay? The difference between this and that is that the wild loof is wild. It's just growing by itself. Nobody grew it for human consumption. It's just there growing. Now, if you want to process it, then it can be considered food after the processing, and once it's considered food, it's susceptible to food tuma, but it's also going to be subject to the laws of Sheviis once you're processing it. If you're not processing it, it's not considered food. So this is a novelty, and we're going to see this novelty that's going to come up from this Mishnah. So the Gemara says that it was necessary to cite this Mishnah here in the context of the discussion regarding Sheviis only because we learn from it that Sheviis sanctity does not take effect upon leaves of wild loof until they are sweetened. So, again, this is something that, and this is a novelty, this is something that's growing by itself. This is not cultivated for human consumption. Yes, humans can eat it, but only with processing, okay? And so this is not the case as a lupine. That they're bringing in this contrast because they want to show you the novelty of this law in the Mishnah. Okay, and so the idea is that only when you're going to get this to be put into a state that a human being can eat it, is it going to get Sheviis sanctity. And before you process it, even though you're going to be eating it, before you process it, it doesn't get Sheviis sanctity and doesn't get susceptible to food tuma. So that's going to be the point at which it gets sanctity. That's a novelty. That's really an amazing novelty. And you'd say, okay, but what about the lupine beans? You also have to process those. And the idea and why they're putting that in there is to say, but wait a second, this is specifically grown just for people to eat it. In the other case, it's not. Big difference. The Gemara now is going to try to shore up this assertion that although the Mishnah does not specify that it actually means that Sheviis sanctity takes effect on the leaves of the wild loof only after they are sweetened. And so now we're going to talk about endives. So the Gemara says that, did Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, not say that wild endives are deemed significant enough to contract food tuma during the Sheviis year, even without any specific intent to eat them? And There's a difference between garden endives, and there's a difference between wild endives. The wild endives are considered to be bitter, and the question is that garden endives are that are not available in Sheviis, and because you can't plant your garden, right? So you can't get the garden endives because you can't work the field to make them. So the only thing that's available is a wild endive. And the idea is that, you don't have to process these leaves. They're a little bit bitter by nature, but because, this is something that, the other one is not available, and this one is available. This one's available out in the Jerusalem forest. And it's going to be a case where before you wouldn't use it as food, but now because of the Sheviis year, you're going to say, okay, the garden ones are not available. These ones are not as good as the garden ones, but I'll still eat them. They're still food. The difference between this and the leaf of the wild loof is that the leaf of the wild loof is so bitter that you can't eat them without processing them. And so with this, you can eat them without processing. And that's why it's trying to draw a distinction between these two different wild species. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that, the idea is that, wild endives in the Sheviis year are automatically going to get elevated to the status of food. And once it's considered food, it's going to have the ability to get tuma, and also it's going to be in a case where it can have Sheviis sanctity. So the Gemara continues and says, and it was stated regarding Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, teaching that this reasoning applies only before Rebbe permitted the importation of greens from outside the land into the land. And there was a rabbinic decree that you have soil from outside of Eretz Yisrael, and that would be tamei, and that would transmit tuma by being carried or by touching it or by putting it into a house. And the law would create this worry that, maybe there's bone fragments in this soil that's coming in from buried corpses. And you normally, when you're picking plants, there will be clods of earth that attach to the roots and everything, or even to the plant itself. So the worry was that by bringing in foreign plants for food, that you can spread tuma into the land. So you still had a day where people were trying to keep the laws of Tohoros, and to prevent this spread of tuma in the land, the sages are going to prohibit the importation of greens and grains into Eretz Yisrael. Okay, now they had this restriction by Rebbe lifted, and there was terrible food shortages at the time. And now, when you had Rebbe lifting this restriction on food imports because of tuma, so that there's just more food available, this law about the wild endive is not going to apply, because now you can get from these border areas, you can get garden endives. They can grow the garden endives in the border areas and bring it in. So basically, garden endives will be available 7 years. And before they lifted the restriction, the garden endives would only be available for 6 years. So before this restriction, this would be the case. So before this restriction gets lifted, you can only have it for 6 years, and then in the 7th year, you're going to go get the wild endives. And you don't need to process them. They're not as good as the garden endives, but they're still a little bit bitter, and it's not going to be considered food until it's the 7th year. In the 7th year, you're going to go gather it. But once this gets restricted, this restriction gets lifted, then nobody's going to go out and collect the wild endives. They're only going to get the garden endives, even the ones that are brought into the land in the 7th year. And that's going to be the idea here. So the Gemara says that once Rebbe permitted the importation of greens from outside the land into the land, then imported garden endives are going to be available in the land even during Sheviis, And the Sheviis year is the same as the other years of the 7-year cycle with regards to the wild endives not being susceptible to food tuma once it has a specific intent to eat them. So this basically has a case where the Mishnah is teaching that endives do have Sheviis sanctity. This is only the wild endives, and this is only talking about the case where, first of all, you have to have intention that you're going to use it as food, and it's also talking about the time before Rebbe permitted the importation. Now, part of the idea is that the Mishnah doesn't talk about this specific time period, and the idea is that this is implying that even after Rebbe permits the importation of greens, endives will have Sheviis sanctity. So why would that be? That would be a case where, for whatever reason, you've decided, I'm going to go in the Jerusalem forest and I'm going to go gather, and now you see some wild endives there. Yes, you could get the garden ones, but you've decided and you put the intention in that, I'm going to use this for food, and you've picked it. Now it's going to be subject to Sheviis sanctity, and so you can't waste it. And also, this is going to be different than the wild loof that might be growing right next to it, because the wild loof needs processing, and the wild endive does not. So if you were to pick the leaves of the wild loof, even with the intention to use it as food, it doesn't count as food until you finish processing it. With regards to the wild endive, if you go and you pick it with the intention to go and pick it, it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. If you're going to pick it for food, you don't need to process it. But ordinarily, in the 7th year, if you're seeing the wild endive, you're not normally going to pick it. You're going to prefer the Sheviis one, the one that gets imported. And in that case, this wild endive that's growing that you didn't pick with the intention of using it as food does not have Sheviis sanctity. So those are the finer points there. So the Gemara is going to say, but here, in the period after Rebbe's permit takes effect, wild endives are not deemed significant enough to be classified as human food, and they will not have Sheviis sanctity until someone has the specific intent to eat them. In other words, the Mishnah is stating that endives have Sheviis sanctity. It does not mean that they automatically get this sanctity when they are picked, but they get this sanctity at the point when there's an intention to eat it as food. Okay, that's when it's going to turn on. So that would also follow that the leaves of the wild loof as well. And so the idea is that the Mishnah does not mean that they have Sheviis sanctity when they're picked. It means that they get this sanctity when they are fit with this processing for people to eat it. And once you finish processing it by soaking it in vinegar water or salt water and getting all the bitterness out of it, you've transformed it into food. There is a difference between the wild loof and there is a difference between the wild endive, because it does require processing on one but not the other, and that is going to be a thing. So in the case of the wild loof, if you go and you pick it and you have the intent you're going to use it as food, it doesn't turn into food until the processing happens. The Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, but do we actually find a product upon which Sheviis sanctity does not take effect at the beginning when it is harvested, yet Sheviis sanctity takes effect at the end? In other words, why is it that with the loof that it doesn't, you've picked it with the intention to eat it, okay, but it doesn't actually get this Sheviis sanctity or even susceptible to food tuma until you've actually processed it? Why is that? In other words, if something is going to be excluded from getting Sheviis sanctity when it's taken out of the ground, so there's another question about this. So it's implied. How could it be that the sanctity turns on once it gets processed, even though it's already been detached? You've already picked it for food, but it doesn't get this Sheviis sanctity until you've actually processed it. That's what the Gemara is wondering. The Gemara is going to respond, and they reply, it says, surely we find a precedent for the notion that Sheviis sanctity takes effect after an item has been taken from the ground. And it says, consider the Sia, the Azov, and the Kurnis. Asav is They say that it's za'atar. Some say that it's oregano. The azov was used for when they were wiping the blood on the doorway in Egypt, and it was also used for sprinkling for the paraduma and making the mayim paraduma as well. So azov has a lot of intricacies in the law in regards to halacha. So, for instance, if you have a garden and somebody has azov growing there, you're allowed to go. It's one of the only things that you're allowed to go pick, because the idea is that it's so readily available that even if it's in a protected garden, somebody won't care that it was taken. It's not going to be considered theft. There's only 3 plants that are like that. Every other plant would be considered theft. It would be considered taking it. In other words, this is always going to have the status of being so insignificant that it's not going to be considered like anything. And that's a key idea with the Jews leaving Egypt, because the Egyptians could say, look, you stole the azov from us. And in the halacha, it's like, this is so worthless. This is so little. This is so readily available and it grows all over the place, that it always in the halacha has the status of basically being free. So it says, consider the seah, the azov, and the kernis. They're going to identify these species in a minute. And it says that one gathered with the intention to use them as firewood. And, in this case, initially Sheviis sanctity does not even take effect on it. In other words, the guy is coming and collecting this to go use it for firewood. He's not even going to use it for animal food. He's not even going to use it for human food. And, so he's, the question is going to be with this, with regards to like potential foods, right? So, if he's gathering it and he's going to say, I'm taking this because I want this on my eggs in the morning, and, za'atar and eggs are nice, or za'atar, or oregano and eggs are nice, and, that's going to be a case where now you have human food. And, if he also is going to be gathering and saying, well, these clumps of, azov are nice and I'm going to feed it to my goats. Well, now you've taken it for animal food, and that's going to be considered to be where it has Sheviis sanctity. And the idea is that once you've picked it up and you've taken it with this intent that, this is my, food for my goats, or this is my, food for my eggs in the morning, this now has Sheviis sanctity once you've picked it with this intent. But if you're taking it as firewood, that is not going to have Sheviis sanctity on it, because you're taking it for something that it didn't turn on Sheviis sanctity. Now, Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, but if he changes his mind and he says for the seah, the azov, or the kernis, and he takes it for the firewood, and then he has a change of heart and he has intent to use them for food, then at that point, Sheviis sanctity will take effect upon it at this time. In other words, we're seeing that something that did not have Sheviis sanctity when it was taken from the ground can get Sheviis sanctity after, and even when it was detached. You've already cut it from the ground, you've already taken it, you've lifted it, you've acquired it, you've moved it, and you can take it all the way over to your house, saying, this is firewood. But once you've changed the status of it, even after you've picked it, now it's going to be classified as something that will have Sheviis sanctity. And so, just like the loof can do that as well, you can pick the loof, you can transport it, you can move it around your kitchen, but it does not get susceptible to food tuma, and it also does not get Sheviis sanctity until you've processed it. So the other idea is perhaps you've even picked these wild endives just to pick them, but once you have the intent that you're going to use it for food, then it's going to be different. So perhaps you're picking them and you're going to, you're going to use it for some other purpose other than food. Perhaps you're going to use it to fuel an oven. But once you've said, this is stupid, I'm not going to use it to fuel an oven, I'm going to going to actually, put some olive oil on it and eat it, a little bit of vinegar, it'll be nice, then it's food, then it has Sheviis sanctity, even after you've picked it. So Rabbi Hanina says that the seya, the ezav, and the kurnis are different than everything else. And it says that they acquire Sheviis sanctity even after they were detached from the ground, because if he gathered them originally with the intent to use it as food, then Sheviis sanctity would have taken effect on it right away. In other words, the minute that these are getting picked, if you have it in the intention that it's going to be used for food, it's going to be susceptible to tuma, and it's going to be subject to the laws of Sheviis. And now, if he's going to contrast this, if he's going to be picking it for firewood, and he takes it and he hauls it away, once he changes his mind and he decides to use it as a spice for his eggs in the morning and turns into food, now it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. Now, the leaves of the wild loof, this is going to be a case where it's unfit for consumption when it's picked. And the idea is that when it's inedible in the beginning, it can't be used, so it doesn't get the sanctity. So the question is, the question that's being posed is, if you know that with processing, even if you have the intention to use it as food. Now, the question here that's going to be iterated by the Chazan Ish is that if they can be used as food and they're picked and you know that you have to process them and they could be turned into something edible, then when you pick the wild loof, is that going to have Sheviis sanctity upon being picked if you picked it with the intention to process it for food, even though you didn't process it for food yet? So perhaps what this is trying to show is that the laws of Sheviis sanctity might not be the same as the law for food tuma. Now, certainly, it does not get food tuma until it gets processed. But what about for Sheviis sanctity? Perhaps it's not going to be the same time. Perhaps it is going to be the same time. Perhaps it might not be the same time. So the Chazan Ish says about this as follows. Chazan Ish says that although the Gemara tries to prove his point specifically from the case of wild loof and the leaves, it emerges that as a rule, Sheviis sanctity takes effect the moment an item is picked, as long as it can be turned into something edible. So Sheviis sanctity would take effect from the moment of harvesting when the item is edible, and all that is lacking is the owner's intent to eat it. So too with wild endives, it would acquire Sheviis sanctity from the moment they are picked, even though the owner did not yet have the intent to eat them. And the only items that do not get Sheviis sanctity from the outset are seya, ezav, and kurnis. And the reason why is because sometimes these will be used as firewood, so they're not classified as food until the owner actually decides to eat them. So the Chazan Ish points out that the laws of when things get food tuma and the laws of Sheviis sanctity are not the same. The timing is not the same. The idea is that once you've picked something, these three plants are the only three plants that will get Sheviis sanctity, depending on if the person changes their mind, because this can be used as firewood. Now, in the case of the wild loof, what the Chazan Ish says this Gemara is trying to prove is that you know that it can be used as food. You're picking it with the intent to use it as food. You don't take your wild endives and use them for your oven. The only things that you would take for your oven are going to be seya, ezav, and kurnis. And these three are different from all the others because these are the only three that are used as firewood that could also be eaten. So in this case, this is trying to show that you know that it's going to be processed. And so once it's picked, you know you're already going to process it. And so once you've picked it, it's gotten the Sheviis sanctity, even if it's not going to be edible at the outset. That's what this is trying to show. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about these three things. Seah is pennyroyal, Azov is hyssop, and Kernus is savory. Now, you can still find these spices in the grocery store today. Pennyroyal is a little harder to find, but it's available. Anyway, these are the three items that are going to be considered to be like so cheap that they're going to have a different set of halacha for everything. And so also it's going to be for Sheviis sanctity, because you can use this as firewood. That's going to be part of the issue. So the Mishnah is going to state, among other plants that have Sheviis sanctity but are not subject to Beur, are going to be the halbitzin. Now, we're talking about a case that we're talking about a different case now from the Mishnah. Okay, so we're shifting topics here, and we're going to be talking about this. We're going to be saying that you have something that is in the field, and it doesn't rot in the field. It continues being in the field throughout the whole winter, and so it's always available. So you can go at any time and it'll be there. It's not going to be like some sort of like cucumber where if you don't get it by a certain time, it's going to rot and it's not going to be available anymore, and they're all going to be gone. In other words, certain things are going to be seasonal. So you go to the grocery store, and you'll see for a couple of weeks you'll see a certain fruit, and then it'll be gone, and that means it's seasonal. There are other kinds of plants, by the way, like the root of the root of the loof. That's going to be available all through the year, so that you could always go out and you could always just pick it. So it's still going to have Sheviis sanctity, but it's not going to be subject to Beur. And so this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about this category of plant that is always available, and it's going to have Sheviis sanctity, but it's not going to have Beur because it's always available. So the Gemara wants to know, what is halbitzin? And the Gemara asks, what is the product called halbitzin? And this says that it is the eggs of the milky blossom. These are going to be like egg-like underground tubers, says the Rashi. And the Rambam, in his commentary to the Mishnah, says that this is an herb that the identity is unknown. So the Rambam says we don't know what this is anymore. The Mishnah states that Rabbi Meir said, even regarding products of Sheviis that are themselves not subject to Beur, the money exchanged for them is subject to Beur, and it must be consumed before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year. But the rabbi said to him that the products themselves are not subject to Beur. How much more so the money exchanged for them? So the Gemara is now bringing up a totally different point, and it's going to be talking about, Rabbi Meir trying to put on a rabbinical decree on the money exchange for Sheviis produce. And the worry that Rabbi Meir has is that it's going to be hard to distinguish between this money and that money. In other words, this money is going to have Sheviis sanctity on it. You've deconsecrated money onto it. And he's worried that, like the time of Beur, that the season will end, the 8th year will end, and now you've taken something that has Sheviis sanctity into another year, and you're supposed to consume it. And the worry is that it might get mixed up in ordinary money. And Rabbi Meir's worry is that if you say, well, we're not going to draw a distinction, and we're not going to limit it to the end of the 7th year, and we're going to say that you always have the time to put in this money. You can always use it even the 8th or 9th year. The idea is that people are going to get mixed up with the Sheviis money and the other money, and they're going to use it for their business, or it's going to get mixed up. And the rabbis are saying that this is a legitimate concern, but what they're saying is that somebody who already is going to be stringent on Sheviis produce and stringent on Sheviis sanctity, and is going to know the rules about deconsecrating the money, that they're already at a higher level spiritually and religiously, and they're going to be more careful to treat the money with this original Sheviis sanctity, because they were treating the original produce with Sheviis sanctity. That's the idea. So the rabbis agree that, yeah, that could be a problem, but the counter to it is that, look, this individual already was so careful about the original Sheviis produce that he knew to deconsecrate it onto the money and to go and exchange it. And if he's already worried about it being, consecrated and the holiness of this money, he's gonna go to the next step and make sure that he's going to be using it appropriately before it turns into the 8th year. That's the idea. The Gemara is going to cite a brisa that's going to actually talk about Rabbi Meir's rebuttal to the rabbi's argument. The rabbi's argument is a very sound, argument. What's Rabbi Meir say to that? The Gemara says that Rabbi Meir says to them, I am justifiably more stringent with the exchange money than with the primary product, as there is a precedent for the stringency. For the law is that oil of Sheviis may be used for kindling lamps, yet if one sells the Sheviis oil and buys other non-Sheviis oil with the money, it may not be used to kindle lamps. So we see here that he's saying, wait a second, what about kindling oil? And we see that, if you take oil that you buy with Sheviis money, it's going to be treated more stringently than the original Sheviis oil, which can have where, the sanctity, would be there. So the idea is that, he's saying that it should be the same for Beur. So yeah, you have this original produce that is a type that's not subject to Beur, but the money that does get exchanged for it does become subject to Beur. He's saying that with this, you've transformed this into money, okay? And so, yeah, it's very good that the oil doesn't get subject to Beur. And yes, the oil will have Sheviis sanctity because you purchased this with money that itself has Sheviis sanctity, okay? But the idea is that the purchased oil should be allowed for the same uses as the original Sheviis oil, where which had its sanctity, before they were purchasing it. In other words, there's two kinds of oils here. One is going to be regular Sheviis oil, okay, and the other is non-Sheviis regular oil that you purchase with Sheviis money. Now, the money that purchases this non-Sheviis oil actually gets more stringencies on it than the regular Sheviis oil. That's the point of Rabbi Meir. And he's saying that just as this oil, now because of the money, has more stringencies on it, so too if you're exchanging the money itself, it's going to burden whatever you're buying with more stringencies. And so the money itself has a power to change it, has a power to actually create more stringencies, and because of that, it should be treated at a higher level, and so it should also be subject to Beur, so to speak. In other words, by the 8th year, the start of the 8th year, it has to be used. That's the worry. That's the idea. And the rabbis are going to be saying that they put on this decree out of concern that if someone was to use this new oil that was just like ordinary oil. In other words, he took this non-sanctified oil, he bought with Sheviis money, he bought this oil. They're gonna worry that this newly acquired oil is also gonna have Sheviis sanctity, and they might actually use it in commerce or misuse it. And so the idea is that if you had genuine Sheviis oil, okay, that oil already would be, recognizable, as he would already know that it has Sheviis sanctity. He would already prohibit it. He would not use it for commerce. But in the case of this other non-sanctified oil that he's buying, perhaps from an earlier year, now with Sheviis money, now it has kedusha, and so they're putting on these extra stringencies to make sure that they don't forget. That's going to be the idea that the rabbis are saying, and the Gemara is going to expand on the prohibition against kindling lamps with oil exchanged for Sheviis produce. So we're going to explain this a little bit. The Gemara is going to explain this a little bit. So again, the case is going to be regular kindling oil, perhaps from the 6th year, and this is going to be purchased with money that has Sheviis sanctity on it, and now this is going to acquire Sheviis sanctity. Yes, it didn't naturally have it, but once you've used this money that has the Sheviis sanctity to buy this oil, now this oil is going to have this new status. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Imi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if one exchanged Sheviis oil with his fellow for other Sheviis oil, both oils are forbidden for kindling lamps, since each of them is oil that was exchanged for Sheviis produce. So what does one do to remedy the situation and permit them for kindling? And Rabbi Hiskiah says in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, he exchanges both of them for hulin. In other words, this is going to be ordinary non-Sheviis produce. So the idea is we're talking about where they're bartering, they're trading, and he's now trading a flask of Sheviis oil for his fellow. Okay, his fellow does not have Sheviis oil, but one guy does have Sheviis oil, and they trade. Now, both of these oils have Sheviis sanctity because the one that did not have Sheviis sanctity was used to acquire one that does have Sheviis sanctity. So now, the guy who had who's now getting the non-Sheviis oil, because he gave up Sheviis oil to get this new product now still has the sanctity. And the first fellow who traded away the non-Sheviis oil in return is getting actual Sheviis oil. So the idea is that they're both getting it. Now, what do you do with this? Rabbi Hiskiah is saying that each one of them would have to go trade it with ordinary non-Sheviis produce. So let me explain this according to the Pnei Moshe. So the idea is that each of the flasks now has dual Sheviis sanctity, and it's going to be this actual Sheviis oil that has its own inherent sanctity, and additionally, it is the oil that was bartered for Sheviis oil that has acquired sanctity of a product exchanged for Sheviis produce. So the idea is that there is a prohibition against selling Sheviis produce, and it does not apply to a minor transaction in which the acquired product is needed for an imminent consumption. Okay, so it's a minor transaction for personal use. He has to use it right away for personal consumption, and normally you can't go and sell it. But in a case where you're using it right away just for yourself, can you acquire it or sell it to someone else who needs it right away for use? Yes, it's not a commercial business. You're not doing business with it. That's the restrictions when you're doing business with it. But if you have a tiny bit of oil and the guy wants to buy it from you, you're allowed to sell it because he's going to use it right away. Now, let's get into this about the bartered oil, because you would say, well, what about this other oil that you're bartering away? Doesn't this new thing get sanctity, and don't you make the same mess all over again? So the law is that when Sheviis produce is going to be bartered for non-Sheviis produce, the Sheviis produce will retain its sanctity with the exchange product, and the exchange product will also get sanctity. Okay, so if this exchanged product now gets bartered for another non-Sheviis produce, its acquired sanctity is going to be removed from it and transferred to the third product. So let's do an example. Okay, the example is somebody exchanges grapes of Sheviis for meat. Now, both the meat and the grapes, which were Sheviis, have Sheviis sanctity. Now, if he's going to exchange the meat for fish, the meat becomes hulin, and the sanctity gets transferred to the fish. So that now the only thing would be that the grapes, which are going to be actually Sheviis produce, and the fish are going to be sanctified, but the meat in this case will be desanctified because you have this third party that basically acted as an exchange. So in the first case, where you're making a heads-up trade, they both get Sheviis sanctity, okay? Now, the guy who has the Sheviis oil, he wants to go trade the Sheviis oil, either guy, by the way. So, hold on a second. So, let's say the guy who has the non-Sheviis oil now, okay? The new guy who gets the non-Sheviis oil, okay? It only got Sheviis sanctity not because it's a 7th year oil, it was a 6th year oil. But it only got it because you bartered it for something that was actually Sheviis produce. Okay, that's what made it. That's what made the whole problem. Now, the way to fix it is you go with this non-Sheviis oil that now has Sheviis sanctity, and you go and you trade it for fish. Okay, so now the fish does not have Sheviis sanctity. Okay, but when that guy is getting that oil, that does have Sheviis sanctity still. Okay, because it had Sheviis sanctity and he traded it for hulin. So you get hulin, but he has something with Sheviis sanctity. That's how it's working. So the Gemara is going to give another case where the product that's going to get exchanged for Sheviis produce is going to acquire extra stringencies that it would not get if it was actually like Sheviis produce. So, for instance, you don't have any of these problems with 6th year crops. You don't have any of these problems with 5th year crops. You don't have Sheviis sanctity problems with fish or with meat. Okay, but now if you're exchanging it for something that does have Sheviis sanctity, now you're getting these problems. So the Gemara is saying if one exchanged Sheviis oil for wine, the law is as follows. Just as you say that Sheviis wine may not be used for anointing and may not be used for kindling, so too the oil exchanged for it, having acquired Sheviis sanctity from the wine, may not be used for anointing and may not be used for kindling. So let's look at the Pnei Moshe, and he's saying that wine of Sheviis may not be used for anointing or kindling because of the general rule that Sheviis produce may only be used in accordance with the normal way to consume it. So Sheviis oil can be used for kindling or for anointing since that's the normal use. Okay? And in this case, the exchange of the oil is going to derive the sanctity from the Sheviis wine, and so it has to be treated in accordance with the stringencies of Sheviis wine. So because it was used to exchange it, you can't use it for anointing or kindling. And this is going to also apply for oil exchanged for Sheviis wine or Sheviis oil that's going to be applied to or exchanged for non-Sheviis oil. And so since, either way, the oil has acquired the sanctity of the Sheviis wine. So that's a novelty. And the idea is that, normally oil exchanged, even for Sheviis oil, is going to be prohibited for kindling by rabbinic decree. Now, this novelty gets brought out when the oil is going to exchange for wine. And the idea is that now you can't even use it for anointing. You can't use it for lighting. And the idea here is that, you're going to get worried with ordinary oil. And the idea is that, oil that gets exchanged for wine is going to get Sheviis restrictions for wine. That's going to be the idea. So we're going to get into tomorrow some more fine points about it and more about Rebbe's. We're going to get more into Beur. Tomorrow we're going to get more into Beur. We're going to get into more fine points about this. But the idea, is that, according to the Vilna Goan, this Bryce is teaching that produce exchanged for Sheviis produce, so regular produce exchanged for Sheviis produce, is subject to the stringencies of the original produce. So if you have oil that gets exchanged for Sheviis wine, you can't use the oil for kindling. And so the produce exchanged for Sheviis produce is subject to the stringencies associated with its own kind. So wine exchanged for Sheviis oil cannot be used as kindling, and although the oil itself is going to be permitted for kindling, the wine itself is never used for kindling. So, in effect, says the Vilna Goan, the exchanged product has the stringencies of both associated products. And so, it basically, since you would never use wine for kindling or anointing because that's not the way wine is used, if you did an exchange, you're basically getting the stringencies of both. So, if you exchange wine for oil, now you're going to have oil that you can't light because you would never light wine and you exchanged the wine for the oil. And yes, you would normally be able to light the oil because that's the normal way to do it. But because you exchange it for something that's not permitted that way, it has the restrictions of both. That's the idea. Have a great day.